Hey guys, if you can tell by the title, another review impressions video on a game okay, I'll be honest. This game, Final Fantasy V, I did not beat. I'll get to it why. First off, I want to start out by saying Final Fantasy series. I just all of a sudden felt in the mood for another Final Fantasy game, and I want to get through every game in this series. And I know I completed Final Fantasy VI for the first time. I think it's a few months ago now. I have a video detailing how I thought about that game. So after that, I wanted to play Final Fantasy IV. I felt that one I needed to be my next in the series. I don't know why I wanted to stick with games in the the 2D like Super Nintendo, NES ones, but I decided to go with that one, Final Fantasy IV. So before Final Fantasy V, I tried this game, Final Fantasy IV, and I just couldn't get into it. It's weird, like, I don't know if it's a mix of like the really old school graphics. I mean, Final Fantasy IV, even though it's a Super Nintendo game, to me it feels like an NES game. And NES RPGs, the old school ones, I find very hard to get into. The battle system just felt really slow. The movement speed was just too slow for me. And the random encounters, like every other step, I was running into an enemy. And these dungeons that I was facing, I played around 2 hours, 2 or 3 hours of Final Fantasy IV on the Super Nintendo. These dungeons were so annoying to explore. I was trying to get all these chests, and it's just a battle every second. I was really having troubles with the fighting, and I don't know, it wasn't doing anything for me. I know that game's considered one of the best games in the series, but I don't know, the random encounter rate and those factors, I don't know, I couldn't get into it. Now, I have heard the PSP version, I think it's called the Complete Collection. The random encounter rate is reduced, and you can run in that game. And it just looks better, I think. I love the updated 2D look of that. So I think I'm going to be playing that version, not for a while. I think I'm going to go I think I'm going to go with like the PS1 Final Fantasies, one of those ones, or actually maybe Final Fantasy X, one of the PS2 ones next. And kind of do it in kind of that order to get through the series, like play a PlayStation 1 game, then play a PlayStation 2 game, then maybe play Final Fantasy 13, then go back. I know Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 3, I know there's the DS remake of 3. I don't know how I feel about that. Like, that has the same visuals that the DS remake of 4 had, and I couldn't get into that game either. Final Fantasy 4, I've tried so many times to get into it, I just can't for whatever reason. But the visual style in that game is just really unappealing to me, those 3D visuals. Like, that game looks ugly, in my opinion. Final Fantasy 3 has the same look. So I don't know if I'm going to play that. As well as it being an NES RPG. Like, they're a bit too old school for me, those three. I think I might try, though, Final Fantasy Origins on the PS1. Try, like, those remakes of Final Fantasy 1 and 2. I might try them somewhere down the line if I'm feeling for another old school, have a feeling for an old school RPG, which is what I had for Final Fantasy 4, but I just kind of moved on to Final Fantasy 5, which is the topic of this video. And even though the encounter rate in Final Fantasy 5 is still ridiculous, like, whereas it's every 2 or 3 steps in Final Fantasy 4, Final Fantasy 5, it feels like every 7 or 8 steps there's a battle. And it still looks like an NES game to me. I was able to get into Final Fantasy 5 a lot quicker. I don't know why. It's weird, but I just was. The battle system felt faster, and the job system was super appealing to me. So anyways, sorry for that long-winded introduction, but Final Fantasy V. Now, I have a love-it-hate-it relationship with this game. I'd say the first half of this game, the first 15 hours or so, it's around a 30-hour game, I was really enjoying. I wasn't loving it, but I was enjoying it. The second half of the game, I don't think I've been this frustrated with an RPG or a game in a long while with the second half of this game. I'll just flat out say, I don't know what other people think, but Final Fantasy V, this is one of the hardest RPGs I've ever played. Up there with the 7th Saga for me. I haven't played like hundreds of RPGs or anything, but this game is fucking brutal. Now, I played the Super Nintendo version of this, a translated ROM, so I'm sorry, I had to abuse save states to play this game, and that's one of the problems I have with it. Save points in this game, there's hardly any of them. In the first half of the game, it's okay, because the dungeons are short. They usually put a save point between every boss, in front of every boss. You can save on the world map and on these save points, and that's it. Those are the only parts you can save in the game. But later in the game, the dungeons get huge, multiple paths, tons of really hard enemies fighting you every 7 steps. It makes exploring a pain in the ass. And a lot of the times, a save point won't even be before bosses. And that's really true with way late into the game. So I had to basically use save states. I can't believe they expect people to go through like these 30-minute to hour-long sections with no saving, fighting bosses and enemies. And the problem I have too with this game, the bosses require a lot of experimentation and trial and error to figure out the exact strategy to kill them. And so when you don't have a save point right in front of the boss, and you have to play an hour-long section just to try out a new way to take down the boss, it's completely tedious. And I know it's kind of maybe unfair to level this against the game since I was using save states, and that relieved the frustration. If you're gonna play this game, unless you're a hardcore RPG fan and you're very skilled at them, or you're very skilled with Final Fantasy series, I'd recommend just playing this game on an emulator, and using save states. Now I don't know what the Game Boy Advance or PSP remakes are like for this game, or PS1 remakes. I don't know if the difficulty was toned down or anything, because this is the Super Nintendo Japanese version I'm playing, just with an English ROM, English translation. But this game is brutal. I wasn't expecting the difficulty, and it kind of spikes in the second half. And now a lot of this was due to how I used the job system, which I'll describe that. I'll talk about the story a bit later. I usually have to talk about the story first, but I'd like to talk about the gameplay first with Final Fantasy V. The job system I thought was really excellent at first. Basically, this game you only control 4 characters throughout the entire game. Unlike Final Fantasy VI, there's not a ton of characters to play through, to play with. And you kind of choose their jobs, whether it be like a knight, mystic knight, white mage, black mage. And basically, you get action points from fighting battles, and they level up your job. And each time you level up the job, you get a new skill. And you can kind of change skills on your classes. So you can choose a knight, learn like a level 2 skill, then change your job to a white mage, and that level 2 knight skill, you can still use it. You can equip it. And jobs can have, I think it's upwards... Yeah, you can have an equipable skill and then the main skill that job has. So it's actually a pretty flexible system. And it's very fun trying to mess with the different skills in the game and seeing what classes work best for different situations. The problem I have, though, because you only get 1 or 2 action points in battle towards the beginning of the game, later in the game it gets a bit better in that regard. It's a very grindy system. If you want the most out of this game in terms of the job system, you gotta grind your ass off. And that goes for the leveling, too. You don't really level up that much in this game. I was around level 30 by the end. It felt that leveling was really slow, and grinding just was a really long, involved process. And, it just was kind of annoying in that way. The dungeons themselves in the game, I think they're designed okay. The puzzles are kind of neat. They're not too annoying or anything. It's just the random encounter rate makes them such a pain in the ass to explore, especially later in the game. In terms of the flow of the game, though, it's you got your typical world map, which is pretty awesome. You got your airships, your boats. It's not a completely linear game. There's a ton of optional content you can do. And later in the game, it opens up quite a lot more, especially before you're ready to take on the final area. So I really liked that. I liked it as opposed to Final Fantasy VI, where the game got really non-linear later, but even though it was super non-linear, you could only go to certain areas since your party wasn't strong enough to access a ton of areas on the map. I kind of preferred this more linear approach, but not too linear. I really like RPGs that play like this. Another problem I had with this game, though, is how obtuse it is with directions. Countless times throughout this game, I'd use a walkthrough. In fact, I'd say I had to open up the walkthrough almost like 30 times throughout this game, maybe upwards of 50 times. Just the game is really bad at giving you directions. They'll just a lot of times they won't even tell you where you're supposed to go, so you're just wandering around aimlessly on this massive world map trying to figure out where you're supposed to go exactly. It's one of those old school design sensibilities. I can't be too hard on the game. I mean, this came out in 1992. But it's one of those things I'm glad, I'm really glad we've kind of gotten to the point where there's auto-saving and saving anywhere in RPGs, because I just don't have the time to play hour-long sections without dying and having to do it all over again when I die. It's one of those things that I don't have the time for it anymore, and I'm glad new games are a bit more mindful of the player's time. Now, I said that I didn't beat this game, and the final boss in this game, I cannot beat him, even with save states, abusing save states even in mid-battle, which I didn't do up until this point. I can't beat him, and I don't know if I played this game wrong, but I have a feeling it's because of the job system, in the sense that if you don't have the proper skills and items even that you can find in the world, and summon skills, if your jobs aren't built out perfectly, if they don't have the right skills, you're not going to be able to beat the game or get past certain battles, I felt. I guess I just wasn't leveling up my jobs enough, and if I wanted to beat the final boss, I hopped on YouTube and watched the ending to the game. If I wanted to beat the final boss, I'd have to leave the dungeon. The final dungeon is long and tedious and just multiple bosses with no save points. I hated it. It really pissed me off. The whole second half of the game, I'll be honest, I was frustrated and pissed off. But I'd have to grind so much to get to the point where I'm learning abilities and transferring them from one character to the other, from one class to the other. The amount of effort I'd have to put in just to beat the final boss, I don't feel it's worth it. But the final boss is brutally difficult in this game. Like, I cannot say enough how hard this game was. I'm sure probably some people find it easy. The job system seems like that kind of thing that you could exploit really easily. I just didn't know how, and I didn't want to read up a lot of tips and strategies and walkthroughs, because I've said before, I don't like using walkthroughs for the game, for RPGs. This game pretty much forced me to, though. I had no choice. But yeah, the gameplay, it's fun. The battle system is nice and quick. I found it wasn't boring. It kept me going. But, I don't know, the first half to me was far more enjoyable than the really painful second half. Visuals, like I said before, it looks like an NES game. A bit more details thrown in. The environments actually kind of look nice, but the character sprites themselves are very tiny. The animations are kind of nice. It's not a beautiful game. In fact, going back to this after FF6, that game is absurd. The jump in quality from like a visual standpoint, and like FF6 was really ahead of its time, I think, especially after playing this, which was still on the Super Nintendo. Sound-wise, your very basic Super Nintendo sound effects. The soundtrack is, I think, the important thing to talk about here. It's all right. I know a lot of people aren't too crazy about the soundtrack in this game. A lot of people don't mention it. In fact, FF5 a lot of people don't talk about, period. It's not talked about as much as FF4 or 6, obviously because it didn't get that North American release on Super Nintendo. But even though the soundtrack, I thought is okay, it's nothing too memorable, but solid overall. There is one track in this game that's fucking amazing. It's one of my favorite songs in a video game now. I know I did a while back that video, top 15 favorite video game songs. This song would make that list. I think it's called Battle at Gilgamesh or something like that. I'll have to look up the name of the song, because once I go through all the Final Fantasy games, I want to do like a top Final Fantasy song list. This would make the list. This song is epic. The first time I heard it, I was just like, oh my god, so amazing. Like, it really stuck in my head, and I love that song so much. And the soundtrack, honestly, I'd say it's worth getting just for that song alone. It's really excellent. But yeah, visually and soundtrack-wise, nothing crazy, but it's not bad. I think the visuals are a nice improvement over FF4, which I definitely felt looked like an NES game. And I guess I'll talk about the story now, but there's really not much to talk about. It is kind of weird. Like, Final Fantasy IV is known for its really involving story, a complex story for the time it came out. I don't know how well it holds up. So it's interesting to see this game because it seems like a step backwards. Basically, I don't want to talk too much about the story because I don't want to go into spoiler territories, but it is interesting how you only kind of control 4 characters in this game. Your main character, his name's Butts, which I thought was kind of funny, although I think it's pronounced Boots. I read online it's pronounced Boots. I think his name's Bartz in the Game Boy Advance or NPS1 version. But basically, you're trying to protect these crystals from blowing up, and it's a simple kind of save the world storyline. That's all I really want to say. There's not much characterization with the characters, I felt. At first it looked like there might be, but there really isn't. There's little nifty touches with characterization in a few spots in the game, which I thought were interesting. There's a few character revelations you'll get to, a few twists and turns in the story. I don't think it's a bad storyline. In fact, I thought it's actually pretty decent, especially since a lot of people consider it one of the worst storylines in the series, I think. But it's not the greatest, admittedly. I do like the villain. He doesn't show up much in the game, just basically towards the end. But I think he's a pretty strong villain. The characters themselves aren't bad. I don't, the storyline, again, not much to talk about. It's okay. Not great. I don't think it's terrible either, though. So I think that about covers it. As I said before, a very love-it-hater relationship. I kind of love the first half, hate the second half. And even though I was having a bunch of frustrations, when I did eventually take down a few of the bosses, it felt gratifying. If you're looking for a challenge, if a lot of RPGs these days are just not doing anything for you in terms of a challenge, definitely try this game out, I guess. It's one of those things where it's like, it's difficult, but it's honestly, being able to save in more spots and having more save points and things like that, it wouldn't have made it necessarily any easier. It's one of those things where it's like, I don't think replaying a very long section of, like, whether it be a storyline type cutscenes, like 30 minutes of cutscenes, or going through the same dungeon you just went through all over again, and you know exactly how to progress and fight the same enemies you've been fighting. Like, to me, that doesn't really make a game harder. It just makes it more tedious. And this game's got definitely a huge problem in that regard. In fact, there's quite a bit of flaws I found with Final Fantasy V. FF6 I definitely much preferred, even though Kefka's Tower in that game was a total fucking bitch. I do like FF6 quite a bit better than this. Where is this going to rank in terms of other Final Fantasy games when I get around to them? I'm not sure. I think it will probably end up being quite low on the list. I don't imagine another Final Fantasy game frustrating me as much as this one did. Maybe the really old ones. But yeah, I like parts of this and don't like parts of this. Overall, I'd say, it's a solid RPG. I still think it's worth playing. If you're looking for, like, a nice kind of stroll through the park, stay away from it. I wouldn't, if you haven't played this game, I wouldn't say it's like a high priority as far as the Final Fantasy games go, but I don't know, it's worth playing if you have nothing else on your plate. In terms of what Final Fantasy game next I'm going to play, I think I'm going to go with Final Fantasy VII. I was thinking of doing them in order anyways, but I don't know, I might get burnt out that way in terms of the PlayStation era Final Fantasies, but yeah, I haven't played Final Fantasy VII. Crazy, I know. It'll be interesting to see what I think of that one. But anyways, I want to thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.